I never wanted this. Any of it. Doesn't matter what you wanted. It matters what you let happen.
Fluorescent light flickers over wet concrete as Min-jae's forearm presses into his brother's throat, his grip tightening with something closer to grief than rage. A few feet back, Dong-yun watches from the shadows, arms crossed, making no move to intervene, his loyalty measured in stillness. Seo-jun could break free, he doesn't. That restraint says more than resistance ever could. "I never wanted this," he says, voice quiet, steady. "Any of it." "Doesn't matter what you wanted." Min-jae's breath fogs in the cold air. A beat passes. Min-jae releases him, steps back, straightens his jacket, a practiced gesture, control reasserting itself, but his hands betray him, trembling faintly at his sides. 34 years. 34 years I earned this family's respect, and in one season I watched it slip through my hands, and you just stood there. 2 brothers, 1 empire, and a secret about to tear them apart from the inside. 3 weeks before this moment, none of it had happened yet.
If you're the kind of viewer who needs to know how this war started, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to where it all began.
3 weeks before the garage, before the rain and accusations, the Kang penthouse still felt like a fortress no one could shake. Seo-jun almost didn't answer the summons. He'd learned over the years that his father's silence was easier to live inside than his attention, and attention was exactly what this felt like. The moment he stepped into the private conference room and found men who ran ports and shipping lanes and half the city's silence already seated, already waiting. Tae-jun didn't look up from the documents in front of him. Sit. No explanation, no context, just the quiet authority that never needed volume to fill a room. Min-jae was already there, standing near the window, not sitting, arms folded in a posture that had always read as command. But something in his face shifted when the door opened and his younger brother walked through it. A flicker, gone almost before it registered. Almost. "I didn't realize this concerned him," Min-jae said, voice even, controlled, the tone of a man choosing his words the way he chose everything, deliberately. "It doesn't," Tae-jun replied. "Yet." The word landed heavier than it should have. Seo-jun felt it too, though he kept his face unreadable, the way he always did, watching, absorbing, giving nothing back. He hadn't asked for a seat at this table. He wasn't sure he wanted one. The meeting moved forward. Numbers, roots, names spoken in the clipped shorthand of men who'd built empires on discretion. Seo-jun said almost nothing. He didn't need to. His father's eyes drifted toward him more than once, brief and unreadable, as if checking something only he could see. Min-jae noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything that touched his inheritance. When it ended, Tae-jun rose first, the others following like men accustomed to a rhythm they didn't control. Min-jae lingered by the door, waiting until it was just the 3 of them. 34 years, and you've never once brought me into a room like that without warning," he said, quietly. Not an accusation, not yet, just an observation, sharp at the edges. Tae-jun met his eyes, calm as ever. There's a first time for everything. He walked out without another word, leaving both sons standing in the space he'd left behind, and leaving Seo-jun with a question he couldn't shake. Why him? Why now? 2 days after the meeting he wasn't meant to attend, Seo-jun kept his distance, but the room he'd sat in still hung over the penthouse like smoke that hadn't cleared. Min-jae found his father on the balcony, alone, a cup of tea untouched beside him. It was the kind of quiet Tae-jun preferred. No witnesses, no performance. Min-jae used to think that meant honesty. Now he wasn't sure. "You've been distracted," Min-jae said, careful, testing the water rather than diving in. "The Incheon contracts, the shipping renewals, you've been handling more of it yourself lately, less through me." "I handle what needs handling. That used to be my job." Tae-jun finally looked at him, calm as still water. "It still is." It should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Min-jae had spent his whole life reading rooms, reading men, reading his father most of all, and something in that answer felt rehearsed, a door closed just gently enough not to look like a door at all. He didn't push further. Pushing had never worked on Tae-jun. He nodded once, said nothing else, and left the way he'd come. Jaw tight, spine straight, a man holding his composure together with sheer will. Dong-hyun was waiting near the elevators, arms crossed, reading Min-jae's expression before Min-jae said a word. "He didn't answer you, not a question." He answered, he just didn't say anything. Dong-hyun's silence had weight to it, the way it always did before he offered something Min-jae didn't want to hear. People don't change patterns for no reason. Someone's got into him, whispered something. You don't build an empire for 30 years and suddenly start second-guessing your own blood, unless someone's planted the doubt for you. Min-jae didn't answer. He didn't need to. The thought had already taken root, and Dong-hyun knew exactly how deep it would grow. Across the city, in a glass office 30 floors above the harbor, a different conversation was unfolding, quieter, colder. A lieutenant leaned toward the man behind the desk, voice low. "Word is the Kang sons aren't as united as they used to be. Something's shifted at the top." Chairman Lee said nothing at first. He simply turned his chair toward the window, toward the lights of a city he'd been patient with for a very long time. "Everything shifts eventually," he said, almost to himself. "The question is, who's paying attention when it does?" Tae-jun sent for him the way he sent no one else. A single message, no explanation, just an address and a time. The warehouse sat near the old fish market, quiet at that hour, salt and diesel thick in the air. 2 of Tae-jun's men stood near a shipping container, tense in a way that told Seo-jun something had already gone wrong before he arrived. Inside, a supplier, mid-level, nervous, sweating through his collar, sat across from an accountant's ledger that didn't add up. "Your father says you're good at reading people," one of the men muttered, clearly unconvinced. "Says you don't need to raise your voice to get the truth out of someone." Seo-jun didn't answer. He sat down across from the supplier instead, folded his hands, and waited. He didn't threaten. He didn't perform patience. He simply had it, endless and unnerving, until the man's own silence became unbearable to him. I didn't take anything, the supplier finally said, too quickly. I didn't say you did. Seo-jun's voice stayed level. But you keep saying it like someone's already accused you. The man broke under a minute. No violence, no raised hands, just the quiet unraveling of a lie that couldn't survive being looked at directly. By the time Tae-jun arrived to hear the outcome, the truth was already on the table, along with the name of who'd actually skimmed the shipment. Tae-jun studied his son for a long moment, something unreadable behind his calm. You didn't want to be here. I still don't. And yet, a small private note of approval gone as fast as it appeared. Min-jae heard about it before the night was over, second-hand, the way he was starting to hear things now. He said nothing to his father. He said nothing to Seo-jun either when they crossed paths in the hallway, tie loosened, eyes tired. They're saying you didn't even raise your voice, Min-jae said, testing. I didn't need to. Min-jae's jaw tightened, the ghost of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. No, I suppose you wouldn't. He walked past without another word, and Seo-jun stood there afterwards, uneasy in a way he couldn't name, because some quiet, growing part of him understood that impressing his father wasn't the goal at all. It had only ever been the beginning of something his father wasn't ready to explain. The old man arrived without an appointment, which alone should have gotten him turned away. Instead, Tae-jun met him personally, in a back room usually reserved for no one, and closed the door himself. Seo-jun only caught the edges of it, a driver's murmur, a name he didn't recognize, spoken like it belonged to another lifetime. When the old man finally left, he paused near Seo-jun in the hallway, studying his face with an intensity that felt like recognition rather than curiosity. You have his eyes, the stranger said quietly, not the ones I expected to see them in. He was gone before Seo-jun could ask what that meant. Tae-jun offered no explanation afterward, only a long silence and instructions to forget the visit had happened at all. Seo-jun didn't forget. He couldn't. The comment sat in him like a splinter, small and impossible to ignore, and for the first time he found himself watching his father the way his father so often watched others, patiently, for something not yet said. Min-jae heard about the visit too, filtered through Dong-hyun, stripped of its strangeness. Some old debt collector from the past, he said, dismissive, already moving on. My father's had 100 men like that show up over the years. It means nothing. Does it? Seo-jun said, not really a question. Min-jae didn't answer. He'd stopped expecting answers from his brother lately, only questions that unsettled him more than silence did. That same week, a courier arrived at Min-jae's office. No card, no sender, just a sealed envelope containing a single page, shipping records, precise and useful, tied to a supplier Min-jae had been quietly struggling with for months. No note, no request, just the information, offered like a hand extended in the dark. Dong-hyun turned it over, frowning. Who sends something like this and asks for nothing? Someone patient, Min-jae murmured, though he pocketed the page anyway. Someone who wants something later. Neither of them said the name aloud. They didn't need to. Only one man in the city operated this way, offering favors like seeds, content to wait years for the harvest. Across town, Seo-jun sat alone with the stranger's words still turning over in his mind. You have his eyes, not the ones I expected to see them in. Whatever his father was hiding, it didn't begin with him. It began somewhere in the past, and it was only now catching up to the present. The document sat on Tae-jun's desk in plain view, as if he'd wanted found rather than hidden. A draft transfer of authority over the shipping division, Seo-jun's name where Min-jae's should have been. Min-jae hadn't gone looking for it, Dong-hyun had. "It's not final," Dong-hyun said carefully, watching his face. "It's a draft." "Drafts become final." Min-jae's voice was quiet, which was worse than shouting. He set the page down like it might burn him. 34 years of proving himself, of bleeding for this family's name, reduced to a few typed lines he wasn't even meant to see. He's already decided. He's just waiting to say it out loud. Dong-hyun didn't argue. He let the silence do what silence always did to Min-jae, deepen the wound until it demanded action. Someone's protecting the timeline, keeping Seo-jun's schedule quiet, moving him around without you knowing. Park drives them both. Park hears everything. He paused. Park could tell you what your father won't. Min-jae didn't say yes. He didn't need to. He looked away, jaw tight, and that was answer enough. 2 nights later, Ah-jae-soo Park's car was run off the coastal road on his way home. Not fatal, not meant to be, only enough to leave him in a hospital bed with a warning wrapped inside the wreckage. A message with no signature because it didn't need one. Seo-jun heard before Tae-jun told him, arriving at the hospital still in yesterday's clothes, finding the old driver conscious, bruised, apologizing for something that wasn't his own fault at all. "I didn't see who it was," Park murmured. "I'm sorry, Seo-jun. I couldn't—" "Don't," Seo-jun said, low, something in him going very still. He didn't know who had ordered it. He didn't need to know. Not really. Some part of him had already guessed, and the guessing hurt worse than certainty would have. For the first time, detachment felt less like control and more like the thing that had let this happen. Somewhere across the city, Min-jae stared at his phone, at the confirmation he hadn't wanted, and felt something in him break quietly. Not with guilt, not yet, with the terrifying relief of finally choosing a side. Chairman Lee's office smelled of cedar and old money, the kind of quiet wealth that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. Min-jae hadn't planned to come. He told himself walking in that this was reconnaissance, nothing more. Lee didn't rise from his chair. He gestured instead, unhurried, to the seat across from him, as if he'd been expecting this visit for weeks. Perhaps he had. "Your father," Lee said, without preamble, "is a careful man. Careful men make decisions long before anyone sees them." He let that settle. "I imagine you've noticed." Min-jae said nothing, which Lee seemed to take as confirmation rather than silence. "I'm not here to offer you an army," Lee continued, folding his hands. "Just insurance. A logistics company, clean on paper, useful in practice, that happens to move things quietly when quiet is needed. No strings, no loyalty oath, just a door left open in case the one you're counting on closes." "And what do you want in return?" Lee smiled, faint and unhurried. "Nothing yet." A pause, deliberate as a held breath. "Men like your father built empires by making people owe them favors they never asked to collect. I find it far more elegant to simply be patient." Min-jae studied him, aware, some part of him aware, that this felt too easy, too clean, a hand extended without a price tag visible anywhere on it. But he thought of the draft transfer on his father's desk. He thought of Park in a hospital bed, of Seo-jun's silence answering questions Min-jae hadn't even had to ask. He thought of 34 years and how quickly they could be erased by one signature he hadn't been in the room for. "Fine," Min-jae said, quieter than he meant to. "Insurance." Lee's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes settled, satisfied, the way a man's expression settles when a very long game finally tips in his favor. Neither of them said the word alliance. They didn't need to. Min-jae left the office telling himself he'd lost nothing. He didn't look back to see Lee watching him go. Patient, certain, already counting the cost Min-jae hadn't yet realized he'd agreed to pay. Seo-jun found his father alone in the study, long after midnight, the old man staring at nothing, a glass of untouched whiskey catching the lamplight beside him. It felt less like a request for company and more like a summons that had simply forgotten to announce itself. "Park is stable," Seo-jun said, though that wasn't why he'd come. "You knew who did it before I did." Tae-jun didn't deny it. He rarely bothered denying things once they were already true. "I knew who was capable of it." "Then why not stop it?" "Because some things a father can only prevent by naming them out loud, and naming them destroys the son I'm trying to save as much as the one I'm trying to protect." He finally looked up, tired in a way Seo-jun had never seen on him. "Sit down. You've earned part of an answer, if nothing else." What followed wasn't the whole truth. Seo-jun understood that even as his father spoke, but it was more than he'd ever been given. Decades ago, before either son existed, Tae-jun trusted someone the way he now feared trusting Min-jae, a man who mistook ambition for loyalty and nearly burned the empire down proving it. "I built this family on the belief that hunger makes men strong," Tae-jun said quietly. "It took me most of my life to understand that hunger only makes men fast. It doesn't make them safe to hand a kingdom to. And I'm safe? You're something rarer. You've never once asked me for this." Tae-jan's eyes held his. "Your brother has been asking his entire life in everything but words. That frightens me more than it should." Seo-jun sat with that a long moment, the old stranger's voice echoing faintly beneath his father's. You have his eyes, a thread still unspooling, still not fully in his hands. But something else settled in him instead, sharper than curiosity. Park's bruised face, Min-jae's silence in the hallway that hadn't been silence at all. It had been guilt, hiding in plain sight. Detachment had never protected anyone. It had only given the danger room to grow. "I'm not doing this for the throne," Seo-jun said finally, rising. "I know. That's precisely why it has to be you." Seo-jun walked out already thinking of his brother, not with anger, not yet, but with the cold, dawning clarity of a man who finally understood exactly what he needed to protect his family from. Min-jae summoned Seo-jun the way their father once summoned men who owed him something, a location, a time, no explanation. Seo-jun went anyway. Some part of him had been waiting for this since the hospital hallway. The garage was empty at that hour, rain drumming steady on the concrete overhead, red emergency lights pulsing against wet pillars like a slow heartbeat. Dong-hyun was already there when Seo-jun arrived, leaning against a pillar with the stillness of a man who'd been told not to interfere unless told otherwise. "You've been busy," Min-jae said, stepping out from beside the car, voice controlled in the way that always meant it wasn't. "Meetings, errands, little tests you keep passing." He let that sit. "Funny how none of it ever needed my approval." "I didn't ask for any of it." "No," Min-jae's jaw tightened. "You never ask, you just let it happen to you, and somehow it always happens for you." He closed the distance between them fast enough that Seo-jun didn't step back. "Park is in a hospital bed because of what I did. I know that. I live with that." His voice cracked just once before the controls slammed back down over it. "But you knew, didn't you, about the draft, about all of it, long before I found it myself." "I didn't." "Don't." The word came out raw. "Don't lie to me in this family. It's the one thing we've never done to each other." Rain filled the silence between them. Then Min-jae moved, fast, furious, driven less by strategy than 34 years finally giving way all at once. He shoved Seo-jun back against the car, forearm to his throat, gun drawn but pointed low, not yet raised, as if some last fragment of him still refused to cross that particular line. Seo-jun didn't fight back. He could have. That restraint was worse than resistance would have been. A silence that looked too much like guilt to a man already convinced of it. "You knew," Min-jae said, low, shaking. "This whole time you knew, and you said nothing." Seo-jun held his gaze and said nothing now either, not because he had no answer, but because no answer would reach his brother in this moment, only make the wound deeper. Min-jae's grip tightened. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled across the city like the empire itself was holding its breath. The garage stayed frozen a moment longer. Brothers face to face, rain and silence and 34 years of unspoken resentment hanging between them. Then Tae-jun's voice cut through it, quiet as ever, though he was nowhere in sight. "Let him go, Min-jae." He stood at the entrance, unhurried, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment rather than arriving in the middle of it. Dong-yeon straightened but didn't move. Min-jae's arms slackened, though his eyes never left his brother's face. "You want the truth," Tae-jun said, stepping closer, voice steady even as it carried the weight of decades. "Years ago, I trusted a man like you, Min-jae, hungry, brilliant, certain the empire owed him for his loyalty. He nearly destroyed us, proving it. I buried that failure so deep, I told myself it was history. It wasn't. It was a warning I refused to hear until I watched the same hunger start rebuilding itself in my own son." Min-jae's hand fell away from the gun entirely now, some rigid certainty in him finally breaking apart. "I didn't choose Seo-jun because he wanted this less," Tae-jun continued. "I chose him because he never once needed it to know who he was. That's not weakness. It's the only thing that's ever kept an empire like ours from devouring itself." He held Min-jae's gaze, unflinching. "You are still my son, but you were never going to be safe carrying this alone, and neither was this family in your hands." No one spoke for a long moment. Rain kept falling. Somewhere behind that silence, Min-jae's fury finally had nowhere left except grief. Weeks later, Adjusi Park returned to the house on unsteady legs, waved off every offer of help, and resumed his post behind the wheel like nothing had ever tried to take him from it. Seo-jun stood in the doorway watching him settle back into a life he'd nearly lost, proof, if he needed it, of exactly what all of this had been worth protecting. He hadn't wanted the throne, he still didn't, not really, but he understood now what his father had always known, that some men take power to fill something empty in themselves, and others take it because someone has to, so the people they love don't have to bleed for it instead. Seo-jun accepted his father's legacy that season, not as a crown, but as a promise. The empire had changed, so had he. And somewhere across the city, Chairman Lee was still watching, patient as ever, waiting to see exactly what kind of king this quiet son would become.